And we will now switch to English. And the next session is labeled Procurement for Innovation and Diversity. And we have a group of highly interesting people here. And I will shortly introduce them. First we have Professor Andrei Schleifer of Harvard University. He's one of the most renowned scholars internationally. And his research embraces fields like institutional economics, corporate governance, behavioral economics, law and finance. And he has, in several articles, addressed the issues of when we should allow private service providers. Already 50 years ago, he wrote a very interesting article, State versus Private Ownership. And in that article, he actually puts forward a number of criteria when it's suitable to outsource to private service providers. Among those are that you must be able to set up an enforceable contracts when it comes to quality. There should be scope for innovation. Competition must work at least at some stage in the process. And the service provider should be sensible for reputation. It's a reputational good that is provided. And if you don't provide the right quality, that should hurt your brand. So that's part of the findings in Professor Schleifer's research. And then after that we have comments from 3 speakers. And the first is Johanna Adami from Vinnova, who is head of division for Hälsa, and I don't know the English name for that. How you call it in English? Is it up there? Maybe no. After that we have Börje Ekholm, who is CEO of Investor, and I'm happy to see that Börje has arrived. Welcome. And then Mats Bergman also, who is professor at Södertörn University. We're waiting for Professor Schleifer's slideshow to come up here, and I think there we are. 1 minute. Okay. Ready? Okay. Do you need a headset, I guess, or?
Yeah, I need to have it's too many things.
Okay, so we have allotted 20 minutes to Professor Schleifer, and then 10 minutes for each commentator, and then we invite you to pose questions as well. So we're all set?
Yes.
The floor is yours. We're happy to have you here. Most welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to try to make a few remarks, maybe of some general nature, about the question of privatization, and particularly privatization of services. So the way in which I would like to do it is in 3 steps. First, the first part, which will be actually will look like it's not entirely serious, but it's actually extremely serious, will be my way of thinking about the basic logic of contracting out and privatization. And then I'll talk about some of the evidence that I've put together, or that I've looked at on this question, and then I will try to come back to some of the difficult conceptual issues of quality of the provision of public services. So why do I think that privatization is a good idea, or how do I try to explain it? Well, the way in which I try to explain it is on the basis of my own university, which is Harvard University, which is, even though it's a private university, it's really a lot like the government. I will try to talk about the procurement issue in the context of Harvard University. And I'll talk about the procurement of one particular item, which in fact Harvard procures, as you'll see, in a variety of ways, which is tuna sandwiches. Now, it turns out that Harvard does this in different parts, in different ways. So there is a thing which is like the government, which is called the University Health Services, which University Health Services, or University Food Services, that sells tuna sandwiches. So here you see this particularly appetizing item called tuna sandwich and cucumbers that is a government-produced, if you like, government-issued tuna sandwich. It costs $6.40, and this sandwich you can buy at the university, actually very close to my office. This is what it looks like. As you can see, this is you can call it a see-through tuna sandwich. And it costs $6.40. Now, that turns out to be the case that is not the only way in which Harvard procures tuna sandwiches. So, oh yeah, I should also point out, this is what goes into this tuna sandwich. You probably don't want to know because you'll get poisoned. I want to compare this to several modes of provision. So this is something called Dado, which is a private shop that also makes tuna sandwiches. And if you look at the tuna sandwich of Dado Tea, this is what it looks like. As you can see, it has a great deal more tuna. It has a great deal more vegetables, and it actually looks quite a bit more delicious. So this is public and private right next to each other. Now, it turns out that there are other modes of provision. So whereas Harvard College makes its own tuna fish sandwiches, the professional schools at Harvard pursue contracting out, which is to say that they have private providers of tuna sandwiches that actually operate the facilities. So this is what it looks like, and this is what the tuna sandwich looks like. You see, it's actually almost as good as the private tuna fish sandwich, and it has a picture. And I just want to draw your attention to the difference between the publicly provided tuna sandwich and the contracted out tuna sandwich. And of course, then there is, of course, Harvard Business School, which also pursues contracting out. This is what it looks like, in case this is what the dining room at Harvard Business School looks like. It's not exactly like an ordinary university. But they as well, you know, they have two pickles because they have to have something better than the law school. And you can see that this is also quite a delicious looking tuna fish sandwich. So here you have it within the context of Harvard University, the three modes of provision: in-house, government-provided tuna fish sandwich, totally private tuna fish sandwich, and a contracted-out tuna fish sandwich. Now, you might think that the Harvard tuna fish sandwich is actually much cheaper, given what it looks like, and that's the advantage of government provision, is that it's less expensive. But here are the prices for your enjoyment. Greenhouse Cafe, which is Harvard government-provided tuna fish sandwich, costs $6.40. It has no pickle and no chips. The privately provided tuna fish sandwich costs $5.50.
Sorry, I think you're, yeah, exactly, because it's like a little planet around.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Is it working better?
No, not really, no.
Okay, well, I mean, something is wrong with the microphone or with my ear. I'm not going to.
I think you have to there somewhere.
Like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Dado Tea one is actually $1 less expensive, even though it's so much better looking. And the contracted out tuna fish sandwiches are also cheaper than the worst quality government provided or Harvard provided sandwich. So there is more or less in this tuna fish example the basic narrative of why one might think privatization or contracting out are good ideas, which is that you get both higher quality and lower prices. What I should emphasize to you is that actually what's interesting is that the private provider, the .ot option for tuna sandwiches actually has to pay rent in Harvard Square, which is quite expensive, and it still provides something that is cheaper and of higher quality. Now, it turns out that it's actually even worse, which is quite aside from Harvard selling the worst sandwich. It doesn't even make it itself. It buys it and then resells it from something called Raquel's Food Corporation. But what's remarkable about that, which is some wholesaler, is that Harvard pays $3 for this sandwich. You can see this here. And this is what I mean, when I discovered this is what a eureka moment. The suggested retail price for this sandwich is $5.40. So Harvard charges its students even more for this sandwich than is suggested by this producer. So you can ask yourself what's going on, why such low quality and such high prices. And again, the answer is going to be perhaps related to some of the things we talk about in the context of privatization of public services more generally. First of all, Harvard pays its food service employees exactly 3 times more than private providers. So the starting wage for a Harvard food service worker is $22 an hour, plus a full level of benefits, whereas the going wage in Harvard Square is about $8 or $9 an hour. Second, Harvard has this enormous staff of managers and bureaucrats who oversee the food services, something that .ot simply. And then, so I think some of it is wages, some of it is the efficiency, but the bottom line is that students pay. They're a captive audience in some sense. They have to walk 5 or 10 minutes to get a private tuna fish sandwich. And Harvard, and that is the situation. So that's the end of my conceptual slideshow. Let me now get to the more serious issues about public sector procurement, which is, why do I think that this narrative of tuna fish sandwiches actually tells you so many things about privatization of a variety of government services. Now, let me first say a few words about the United States and then maybe a couple words about Sweden, which I certainly am not an expert on. In the US, there's been a substantial move to contracting out. Probably the biggest influence or the biggest most noticeable change has been in education, and particularly in the creation of charter schools, which are private, usually not-for-profit schools that compete with public schools, which receive money from the government at the same level, supposedly as per student as public schools do, and which are not in principle supposed to select their students. Now, because there are so many charter schools in the United States, there's been an enormous amount of economic research on their performance. They were extremely controversial. They are heavily opposed by teachers' unions. And as a consequence, they have difficulty of finding space because public schools often have their buildings built by the government. Now, what is interesting about the research on charter schools is that as best as I can evaluate the evidence, and I did try to do some work on this before I came, is that they've been extremely successful, that they seem to be, in many instances, improving student performance, actually by a substantial margin, but also operating at lower costs than public schools. In fact, what's interesting about charter schools in the United States is because there is such a crisis in education, and particularly in high school education in the United States, I think that even big parts of the more sophisticated left in the United States, including the president, have now become supporters. Now, you can ask, why do charter schools function better? And I think the fact that they've been going, they've been there for so long now, actually lets us understand the production function, lets us understand what they do better. And it seems to be, at least that this is my evaluation of the available research, is that there are three factors that go into performance. The first one, and maybe the most important one, and though that's debated, is that charter schools can fire bad teachers. There is now really quite overwhelming evidence from both comparison across the types of schools and within public schools that the worst teachers actually do quite a bit of damage to the students, just as the best teachers actually improve the lives of their students many years or decades after the students have interacted with them. So the fact that there is some turnover, I'm not talking about 30 or 40% turnover, but 5% turnover of the worst teachers seems to be quite beneficial. The second reason is a longer school day. I mean, one of the things that happens in the United States, again, partly because 100 years ago it was an agricultural country, and partly because this has been locked in, and is that the kids have a relatively short school day, very long vacations, as you know, summer vacations, and as a consequence, the actual number of hours in school is not that high. So in one of the changes, one of the reforms you see in almost all charter schools, or in many of them, is that kids stay at school longer. They do their homework at school, they do other things at school, they don't just go off very early and play sports. And finally, the third intervention that charter schools should do is that the fact that small group tutoring of lagging students. And again, I'm not an expert on education, but I think that I've tried to talk to a number of my colleagues who are significantly to the left of me in terms of their political views. Yet I think that it's a fair statement that the assessment of charter schools in the United States is really extremely favorable. Now, I've also briefly looked at the Swedish evidence, or at least at a few papers, and again, here the story seems to be extremely favorable toward the privatization development. So in schools, there is a paper by Hallmark that I've looked at, which shows significant benefits of private schools for the productivity of schools. There's also quite a bit of work in Sweden. This was actually very interesting on elderly care. I noticed that the symbol of this country has something to do with elderly care, I assume. And there's a study by Bergman, Lundberg, and Spagnolo that looks at the quality of elderly care and shows that both in terms of mortality outcomes and in terms of customer satisfaction, contracting out and private provision seems to be more successful. There's a paper by Stolt, Blomqvist, and Lindblad, and probably close to mispronouncing the names, so I apologize for that, which also presents evidence of increases in quality the quality of meals. So again, I can spend hours here and put you all to sleep summarizing all the evidence, but I think that on net, the evidence in different countries shows there are some substantial general benefits under for the quality of leadership. Now, I do not want to conclude from that this is kind of a universal law of physics. There are also examples of situations in which private provision leads to very poor outcomes. The most conspicuous example of that in the United States is the creation of for-profit university, often online for-profit universities that grant degrees. Now, it turns out that this is a highly distorted market in the United States where students can use loans, government secured loans, to pay for their education. And there is a pretty substantial incidence of defaults on these loans. And so what we've seen in the rise of these for-profit colleges is exactly what you would expect to see when there is a market distortion to begin with, which is that there are these colleges that recruit or market to students, offering to fill out their student loan applications for them if they come. They charge high tuition. Students don't pay themselves. They actually pay with these government loans. And then we know that, in fact, students don't do well after they graduate. They end up with huge student loans. And then they often default. Some prison privatization, although in net prison privatization, surprisingly, has been quite successful in the U.S. There certainly have been some examples of it. Which leads me to the central question, or that I would like to devote a bit of time on, which is how do we deal with quality? What are some of the ways that practice suggests of dealing with non-contractable quality in the provision of public services? This is a topic that I worked on 15 or 20 years ago, and it has become the absolutely central topic in thinking about provision, which is how can we deliver accountability. Now, let me make 4 points in this. Public provision precisely the fact that public schools are by far the greatest in relatively poor areas of the United States, in the cities where the failure of public schools is quickest. When people look at, compare the performance of charter schools and public schools in rich suburbs of American cities, they find very small differences. The reason for that is because public schools have a lot of resources and in fact they operate reasonably well. So it seems to me that, there is the old saying, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. It seems to me that the biggest opportunities and the best opportunities for privatization of public services are often in places where government provision doesn't work. Now, having said that, it seems to me that there are 3 basic issues here. The first is the contract or regulation or whatever you want to call it, which is to say that privatization or contracting out government services is most effective where the effect goes into specifying, stipulating performance criteria, into evaluation, and into often specification of actual inputs and constraints. If you think about the contrast between charter schools, for example, the successful, and private for-profit universities, it's pretty clear that in the case of charter schools, there is a certain curriculum which is largely governed by education. There's a certain amount of staffing that we have to deliver standardized tests, so this limits the opportunities for what you would say is quality reduction or in a non-contractable situation. If you think about for-profit universities, there is basically nothing. University has no contract. There is just student loans. So if I'm a for-profit university and I can attract students to study puppetry and to borrow $30,000 a year from the government to pay the tuition, there's absolutely nothing in the system that stops me from doing that. So it seems to me that the place where this contracting actually does work extremely well, this is a topic I've worked on myself, is privatization of prisons, which is, we're not talking about prisons for dangerous criminals, we're talking about minimum security or low security prisons. And in this area, the privatization has in fact provided services with relatively few scandals and at a very, very high level. The second critical ingredient of success is choice. We can think about the government's ability to supervise the quality of the provision, but of course the people who have the best knowledge of the quality are the customers themselves. This is, by the way, one of the deterrents to prison privatization. You actually don't want the prisoners to choose which prison to go to. But it works much better with schools. It works much better, obviously, with healthcare or with elderly care, because to the extent that the customers have a choice of where to go, that imposes a tremendous amount of discipline on the target. And in fact, going back to Milton Friedman, who advocated private schools in the United States, what was interesting, what he emphasized, is not so much private ownership, but school choice and competition among schools for students as the mechanism to improve outcomes. And finally, the fourth issue that I want to emphasize in my discussion is voice, which is to say that all these arrangements, contracting out, work much better when there is a mechanism whereby dissatisfied customers can air their concerns or their complaints, and where the quality of the provision becomes public information. Of course, most importantly, this is a mechanism that improves the quality of choice, which is to say, people know that a particular school is not doing well, students are not doing well on the standardized tests, or the parents are unhappy with what happens in school. People can voice complaints if there is some way of registering those complaints and making it public. That significantly improves the mechanism of choice, but also enables the government to perhaps intervene when quality provision is suffering. It doesn't mean that all problems can be cured or can be solved with a combination of publicity, these kinds of provisions more generally. A combination of choice and publicity, I think, can address many of the problems. So let me just summarize, and I'm happy to answer questions or participate in discussion. The central questions, the central message of what I've seen both in Sweden and in the contracting out of public services has by and large been a very successful effort. There are many successes. There are also a few problems, but the lessons for problems is not to go back to the Harvard tuna fish sandwich, but to actually try to figure out how the problems can be addressed and what can make the contracting out more successful and efficient. Okay, thank you. Let me stop here and we'll take a break.
Thank you very much. This is not on. If you like to sit or stand here, it's up to you, but I would like to ask Johanna Adami to provide your comments, and then we have the discussion and the Q&As. So please, Johanna, and do you have a... There you are. I think we shall avoid the one that Professor Schleifer used. Stick to that one. Carry on. Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yes. So thank you very much, Professor Schleifer. It was very interesting to listen to you. Representing now an agency under the Swedish government, I will try in a few minutes to explain the rationale for the actions that we see forward from the Swedish perspective. You mentioned a few examples evaluating the initiatives that have been going on in Sweden in privatization of the welfare sector. However, I would say that there are some analyses that are also widely discussed in Sweden, showing, for example, that there is an inflation in school grades among the private school performers, and also, for example, we had a deregulation of the pharmacies in Sweden some years ago. Some reports are coming now that yes, availability, opening hours were better. However, they don't have the medication on the shelf any longer because they cannot store so much, and also patient safety has been questioned. So, being a Harvard-trained clinical epidemiologist, I would say that the evidence so far in the Swedish model is too scarce. Then coming over to what can we do with this and how to evaluate this in our context. I first want to start with a report, a review that OECD launched this year, where they reviewed the Swedish system as of today and also came with recommendations in our R&D and innovation system. And what they identified for some of the success factors after the Second World War was that we were able, in this very small country, to really base long-term relationships between the public sector and the private sector. We have a really fast adaptation to global changes and some very strong private-public partnerships with really big companies such as Alfa Laval, ASEA Brandoveri, Volvo, so on and so forth, was kind of form the basis for our innovation system. The Nordic supermodel in the economy earlier this year. What they in that report identified as maybe different between let's say the cultural mentality and how we perceive the public sector in the Nordic countries versus other countries, were, for example, that we have less corruption. And that our population has a very strong belief in strangers in this country being the public sector, combined with very strong belief in human rights. to that very skilled people also are very active to go to and work in the public sector, keeping a high quality. So, what to do now? What is the aim for the governmental initiatives as stated in our Research Innovation Bill launched earlier this year, in the national strategy and so on? We should have, now I'm focusing on healthcare, we should have the best healthcare services or health services on a very high level. We should promote excellence in research so we can have even more Nobel Prize winners from Sweden, even though over the last years the US is taking over. And we should have an attractive innovation system in order to attract investments from in a global perspective. This means the 3 pillars here in our country are run by 3 different departments at the ministerial level. Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Enterprise, which my agency belongs to. We need to minimize fragmentation. That's a clear thing. And what the government now aim to do, and some of the initiatives we are taking, is that we also heard this before. First of all, yes, we have to define the goals, the measurements, what to measure, what is quality, as you say, because I think that is the basis why we haven't evaluated, we have just implemented different or outsourced to different partners, but it was for maybe ideological reasons or for other reasons. Define that. Then we have to educate those in the system. If it's education in procurement, leadership, so on and so forth. We have to define and evaluate which incentives work in order to promote behavior changes or innovation diffusion and so on. Legislation, government are of course also of importance. And then we find best practice. A best practice where we can here, for example, have money for test beds, demonstrators, and so on. A best practice that is really evaluating the outcome on all levels. Satisfaction, health economy, socioeconomic factors, and so on and so forth. And it should be based on a demand-driven innovation. There should be a demand. We know that being a healthcare professional myself, and I have a critique, which I agree on, that 40% of what healthcare delivery is doing today in Sweden and elsewhere in the Western world is non-evidence-based medicine. But you have to... Only 40, yeah. At least 40. But in order to change it, we need to then go to the policy makers. And I would say that yes, we started. We have now a number of initiatives in innovative reimbursement models that we launched CALM very soon after New Year. We have innovation centers that were first started government and council, right? But now they've been shown that the results are overwhelming in an innovation and prosperity perspective. We have test beds, as I say. We have procurement and innovation. Find the examples. We have so many examples, successful examples, procurement innovation, but not in the health sector. So we just have to overcome that and evaluate them.
Johanna, I am slowly approaching. You know what that means.
Okay, so I'm done.
Round up, please.
More evidence is needed. We're going to help to support to find the evidence.
Thank you for some very good comments and putting up an agenda there. If it's okay with you, we take the comments, all of them, and then we get back to you. Okay, then I'd like to invite Börje Ekholm, CEO of Investor, to provide his comments. Investor has engaged in these sectors. It's and Börje has been active in the debate as well. So please, we're looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Pontus. Thank you, Mr. Schleifer. Very interesting speech. As you may guess, I'm a free market type of guy, so I see a lot of familiarities in there. But I would also say that we shouldn't take everything from the US. As an American myself, I'll just compare the tax returns filed in Sweden and the US. I filed about 7 pages in Sweden. In the US, last I counted, it was 248 pages. And that's actually up by about 20 pages over the last year. That's why due to me having non-US assets. As I live in Sweden, I have some non-US assets. So I don't think we should learn everything from the US. But I do think there was a lot of good things that came out in your comments that I think can well be transferred. First of all, we in Investor, we have approached call it the welfare sector. So we are in both healthcare, but also education. And I do think we have tremendous challenges in both those areas. So if you look at, for example, elderly care or healthcare, we are slowly getting older in Sweden. The demographic profile will be quite alarming over the coming 20 years with a rapid growth of 65-year-old and plus, while the population working will be more or less flat. So I think that to me points to a challenge the system have of better using the resources. And to me, there are, in a way, a few ways to solve this problem. One is, of course, to raise taxes. I don't think that's possible in Sweden. Another one is, of course, to restrict the usage. So, i.e., capitation in a way. We stop people from getting some certain services. Or the last way, which I think is the key way forward, is actually innovation. We have to innovate, we have to be better, much more efficient, finding new ways to operate, and that's the key challenge. And that's where I think the free market comes in. Actually creating competitive-like situations with choices will help us innovate. I'll be back to that. At the same time, we have a debate in Sweden today that in a way profit is bad. As a matter of fact, that would mean loss is good. I have a tough time understanding why it would be good to have loss-making companies in Sweden. So I think profit is actually a good thing. But what I find even more worrisome is the focus on input factors, as I call it. We focus on the number of teachers per student, the number of workers in elderly care home, in nursing homes. We should focus on the output quality. That's the key. So for example, take Kunskapsskolan that we are co-owner of. Here we have teachers working with students. They spend 27 hours per week in front of the student. The Swedish average is 19. That's not because they work longer days. That's because we try to minimize the time we spend outside the classroom and put more emphasis on spending time with the teachers. Another example, just take it from the industrial business. Scania has doubled the manufacturing of trucks and kept the number of employees flat. I do not think that meant the quality went down. As a matter of fact, for me, quality and cost go together. If you focus on quality, we'll get better productivity as well. There is no such thing as, or the way it is that the most expensive thing you can have in any business is poor quality. Then I think there is another issue that we often do not think about, and that's today when we discuss for profit in welfare, is of course we think it was greater in the 70s. As a matter of fact, if you read history, and I was a little bit younger at those ages, but it's clear we had issues at that time also. So for example, a system that doesn't allow free choice and may not allow free entrepreneurs often end into queuing problems. You create a waiting line, for example, to do a surgical procedure. Who benefits from that? I actually think it's the, if you would use the term nomenclatura, right? The very senior levels of society, because they can place a phone call to the local hospital and say, I can probably get past that line, right? And get a faster procedure. So in a way, I actually think a system that allows free entrepreneurship, in a way, opens up for a reduction of queues as well. You may not have said that in your speech now, but I do think that's a consequence that's very interesting, that we open up for call it those benefits on the side that I do not think is particularly democratic. So I think there are a couple of things we should do in Sweden. One is, of course, to focus on free choice. So take, for example, elderly care. I think it's much better to allow each individual to choose which nursing home you go to. I think that lends itself very well to that model instead of publicly serviced or contracted out. Because the free choice actually allows companies to start building something the consumer would like to have. And I often think here about Henry Ford in 1910 when he said that, you know, if I would have asked the consumer what they wanted, they would all have said faster horses. So I do think giving companies an ability to think long term about investments in the product is the key. And a product cannot necessarily be demand driven. It actually has to, as a company, you have to think differently. Steve Jobs thought differently about the smartphone. That is what changes. That's free enterprise. Then I do think we need better transparency on, for example, quality measurements. This applies to education as well as to healthcare. And it has to be very easy to access for the consumer, the citizen of Sweden. They have to know what is good quality, what's bad quality, and therefore we have to invest more in making that work. I also think, for example, on the education side, there is now a, call it grade inflation debate ongoing. I think the best way to get beyond that is actually to rather focus, how do we measure, how do we standardize tests, for example. I think that's a better way to force schools to be more innovative about the way they supply education. I would also say that I'm not believing everything in society should necessarily be coming from private enterprises, but I do think that if we create a healthy competition between public suppliers and private suppliers, I think we create a better market that will lead to better quality, longer term, and actually better efficiencies. And one such area is, for example, look at schools. I think if we apply the same ratio to private schools as well as to public schools in Sweden, we would close a lot of public schools. So out of the 50 worst schools in Sweden, 47 comes out of the public. So I do think applying the same criteria across the system is the key to creating a competitive market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I'd like to ask our last commentator, Professor Mats Bergman. I think you were referred to earlier. I appreciate it very much if you can keep it short, because we're a little bit ahead or stretched over time. And we will carve in a little bit into the coffee break because we started late.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I was in fact. So I'd like to make two, I guess, short comments and maybe one.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thanks for the reference and so on. And yes, I'd like to make two short comments, I think, and maybe two questions. So the observation, I'd like to start out with food. We have actually a famous procurement of food for hospitals in Sweden that was in the news this week. Stockholm County procured food for the hospitals, and it turned out to be a mess. Previously it was made in-house, and then it was procured. And incidentally, I noted that the Harvard food, the bad one, was actually procured, I guess.
It was delivered, it was sold by Harvard employees.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it was the hospital food was procured, and it was procured under a contract that was, I'm not completely sure, but let's say it was like a 2 + 2 or 3 + 3 years, and not very common in Swedish procurement. It was the contract was the option for renewal was not used in this case, which was quite remarkable, because it usually is, and I think that was a very good thing, because if you're not happy with what you procure, and you have this a possibility not to renew the contract, that's a good thing that should be used more often. The other observation I would like to make is on schools. I think it's a little bit funny that Sweden, which is a very liberal in the American sense country, and Chile, which is has at least been a rather conservative country, are the two countries that have pioneered private schools among in the developed the world. Of course, we have private schools in the poor countries, and now the U.S. is coming also in this field. In Sweden, we have approximately 20% of the pupils go to for-profit. I guess you could call them for-profit charter schools or for-profit private schools, which is rather high. And as you said, the results are relatively good, but not. I mean, they maybe perform a little bit better according to most studies, but not maybe by a large degree. Okay, so you mentioned that you want a reputational mechanism. So you want private providers. You want them to have a stake in the game. You want them to have something to lose if they don't deliver in these hard to measure dimensions. And then I was thinking, how would you do that? Some ideas would be that it should be rather tough to get into this market. There should be a tough trial process. You have to demonstrate your ability. You have to spend resources actually to get into these markets. And if you don't deliver in these dimensions, you should be kicked out, and then you will lose money. In particular, if you have to invest in assets like maybe long-term rental contracts for buildings and facilities, you have to invest in your staff, you have to invest in maybe some other stuff. And if you don't deliver quality, in particular if you have a system with consumer choice, you will not be chosen, and then you will lose money. And then of course if you lose money, you also have to earn money if you do this well. So that would be one mechanism. And I think also for your information, perhaps my view on, or my guess, my thinking about the Swedish market is that we have consumer choice here to stay. I mean, this is very popular among the public, so I don't think it will go away. But what is under debate is, of course, the profit. So, yeah. So that's a how do we solve this? I mean, if we have for-profit companies in markets with where quality is hard to measure, and you as a consumer, I think you said yourself, you may not, or maybe heard it earlier today, that you don't know really the quality of the service until you graduate from school to some extent. So it is a little bit difficult for consumers to know. So how do we discipline the private for-profit providers? That's one question. And sort of related to this, the other path to go is to encourage non-profit providers. Maybe should we even not allow for-profit providers? Should we instead have providers among which we can choose different providers, maybe private providers, but non-profit providers? Is that the way to discipline the providers. What are the trade-offs here between these two possibilities?
Maybe we should bring up that then in the discussion, Mats. Or did you have another issue you want to bring forward? We'll get back to that.
I could stop there.
Okay.
Maybe I could just ask one sort of related issue that came up, and I think Börje had a comment on this, and that was what about regulating inputs? That's also controversial, and it's not very popular with the private providers. They don't want to have their inputs regulated, but you actually mentioned that maybe that's a good idea when it comes to schools. So I guess I should stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. And then back to Professor Schleifer, or if I may say Andrei, you can hear we are Börje and Johanna and Matsing each other all the time here. So you have had comments from a governmental authority putting up an agenda, innovation system, interaction. Among the things that you suggested, you had a free market guy. And don't be nostalgic, and I think Johanna had a little bit different view there. And then you have a fellow academician who has some issues that he brought forward. Please.
Thank you very much. Does this work?
Maybe you want.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
No, I don't want to. So, thank you. These are all fantastic comments. Let me just, first of all, in my defense, I just want to make sure that I did not come here, didn't even cross my mind to come here to bring the American way to Sweden. In fact, I was very, very careful. If anything, this was invented in the UK, not in the US. I mean, we should all agree that on any indicators, as was pointed out, that not long before the OECD, Sweden has both a fantastic government and a fantastic private sector. That in fact the performance of the welfare state is at a very, very high level, whether we're talking about government or private provision. That doesn't mean, however, that things can't be improved even in a place that operates extremely efficiently. So that's the first point I want to make. Now, I think there is a common theme in many of the comments, which is to say that privatization or contracting out of these welfare services is often, not always, often, a very good idea, but the contract matters. Which is to say, if it's a case in which consumers can actually observe, verify quality themselves, you probably don't need to go to another supplier. You probably don't need to worry that much about the government contract. If it's the case that the consumers can't verify, you do. So, for example, as you pointed out, standardized tests is an obvious solution to grade inflation. We have grade inflation. It's not just a property, I should point out, of private schools competing for students. If you look inside Harvard University, all of my examples about inefficient government come from Harvard. You know, there is huge inflation in the humanities, the great inflation in the humanities departments because they don't have any students. So the way you attract students to courses in English literature or German literature or what have you is through grade inflation. There's no surprise about that. I don't think it matters very much in this instance because students don't get jobs anyhow, even if but again, if universities' admissions are based on standardized tests rather than grades, giving people high grades is not going to solve the problem. Right? Likewise, when we talk about pharmacies, you know, they can make a standardized list of things that they need to carry, and that goes a long way toward solving the problem. I don't want to go case by case, but I think the general point is the contracts matter. I do want to say that in most instances, I think regulating inputs is not a good idea. It's much better to regulate to make public or regulate or contract out on outcomes. And the reasons for that is that the efficiencies of the private sector come precisely, or to a very large extent, from optimizing inputs. And once you start mandating how many teachers you have and what hours they work and so on, you lose many of the benefits of contracting out. So on that point, I think I do have rather strong views. So let me pause here.
Anyone in the panel who likes to respond? If not, let me ask you the leap from the tuna to say elderly care. How well taken is that argument when you put it forward to a politician, for instance?
Analytically, they're very similar. Look, the issues in privatizations are two. I mean, they're always the same issue, which is cost and quality. Right? We know that private provision is going to be more efficient and it's going to reduce costs. And the question is it going to come at the expense of quality? And what the tuna example demonstrates is that, in fact, you have, through private provision, both higher quality and a lower price, which I believe is the rule rather than the exception. But again, that does not mean that you don't need to worry about quality in situations where the consumers can't verify or understand it properly, and that's why we have contracts, that's why we have competition, that's why we have all these other mechanisms.
Two questions, one there and one over there. So let's start with you, and please introduce yourself. And the third one, yes.
Yes, I'm Mattias Lundbäck, Ratio Institute, Sweden. I have a question. William Baumol, I think, once said that you see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And my question is really, does information technology have anything to do with the introduction of new public management in the 80s or 90s? Or was it a purely ideological drive force?
Anyone who...
First of all, you do see computers in the productivity statistics, and the effects are very, very substantial. So, you know, Baumol may have looked at it a few decades ago. The second point is that, look, the introduction, and this connects to many of the things that were said on this panel, the introduction of these alternative supply methods in the United States is not driven so much by ideology as by the failure in the public sector. Okay, which is why, you know, the first point I made is if it ain't broken, don't fix it. It is precisely because we have a crisis in schools in the United States, particularly in inner city schools, that the charter school movement has gained momentum. It's precisely because in so many because cities don't have much taxes to collect, that you see privatization of many services by cities. It's almost always driven by economics, and it's not a democratic Republican issue. It is to a minor extent, to the extent that public sector unions are often the main supporters of Democratic candidates, as we saw in Boston and New York in the last month. But I do not believe that this is primarily an ideological issue.
One question over there.
Yes, thank you. My name is Magnus Nilsson. I'm a local politician in Solna, city outside Stockholm. Are there any studies on the relationship between private production and the possibility for politicians to keep the costs under control? Because I have we have in Solna, we have the experience that if you produce, for example, healthcare in-house, in October the bureaucrats tend to turn up to our politicians and say that, oh, we are running out of money now. We have to solve the problem. Because in December we don't have any more money, you have to feed us more money. That generally don't happen with a private contractor. They don't turn up at the door in October and say they're running out of money. So it makes it much easier for us to keep control of the costs. Thank you.
Have you decided, gentlemen?
It relates to your issue about losses and profits.
Yeah, but that's why you, as a private provider, you of course you have to make sure that the money you get will earn you a return on your capital. So in a way, you will also, I think, be running your business in a very different way. But I would like to make a comment here on what I often, I think the system of free choice, for example, where that allows the consumer to choose, and it allows me as a business to actually think about investments that favor long-term productivity growth or productivity improvements. Because then it all of a sudden pays off for me to take investments now that may yield a return 5-10 years out. Whereas if I'm under a formal tender, I often have a much shorter period, so I'm more going to run it as a much tighter ship, investing less in what could have long-term gains.
We have a last question, short one and short answer. And that's...
Okay, thank you. Well, I think my question is a follow-up to the previous question, but it relates to Professor...
As long as it is short, it doesn't matter.
It's short. You mentioned among the 3 or 4 issues, you mentioned the difficulties of contracting quality, the importance of choice and voice. And you also said that in general the customer knows best what quality he or she wants. Now, I think this is part of this prison article that you refer to, that you are a co-author of. If you are subjecting an industry to cost cutting, which is very typical of Swedish healthcare today, and also it's a big discussion in the US about Obamacare and the concern about costs. Now, if you start, and this is, if I'm right, remember it right, an indirect conclusion of your article, if you start cutting costs and there is no voice and choice,
hey, Gunnar, it wasn't a lecture.
Then what's going to be cut is quality, and people won't notice it immediately. So that means that you should allow voice as much as possible, even though patients as customers may make mistakes.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. Again, this is not, I really tried to make my remarks carefully. I did not say here, privatize and let it rip. Okay, I said that you need to have mechanisms of putting things in the contract, you need to have mechanisms of customer choice, and you need to have mechanisms of publicity when and information when performance suffers. And prison privatization, to everybody's surprise, actually has worked remarkably well in the United States, and that's a place where a lot of customer choice mechanisms have been shut down. But it worked, so absolutely I couldn't agree more that one needs to be careful, because it's also the case that disasters can be quite severe, as we've seen in the US with for-profit universities.
Mats, you had a comment as well. I've cut your time already, so
yes. So this was a comment coming back to the food example. We have a Swedish municipality that has been innovative in its use of the public procurement rules, and maybe they're breaking the rules. But I know that the Swedish Competition Authority already knows about this, so I don't think I say anything improper here. But this is the city of Östersund, who they don't procure the food, or what they procure is the delivery of food, and then there are 3 restaurants that produce the food, which is then the patients in the hospital and in the elderly care units can choose between these 3 restaurants. And I think that works really well, and it will probably become legal after New Year. So,
oh, even that. Okay, thank you, Mats, and thank you so much for a very, very interesting discussion. And I could carry on for a long time, and I guess there are a number of questions, but let's continue the discussion over coffee, and then we resume here in, say, 20 minutes. Is that possible? Thanks a lot to you all. A big hand. Tack så mycket, Mats.